For 30 agonizing years, my family savagely punished my fake disability. Dad roared, "You're just an attention whore." So I got life-changing surgery in utter secret. For 30 years, every single step I've taken has been a quiet battle, not just with my body, but with the people who should have stood by me the most. I was born with a physical disability that affected how I walk. It's visible, obvious. But to my parents, it wasn't real. They were absolutely convinced I was faking it. I'm not kidding. As a toddler, a literal baby, barely speaking full sentences, they thought I was putting on an act. My father, a loud, angry man from a rough, small-town background, led that belief like it was gospel. My mom? She never stood up to him. She just nodded along or whispered things like, "Try harder, sweetheart. You know how your dad gets when you walk like that." Try harder to what exactly? To magically move like other kids when my legs weren't built the same? They called me lazy, dramatic, willfully clumsy. And my dad's favorite insult, the one he used like a weapon, was attention whore. He'd scream it, red-faced, veins bulging, in public, at home, anywhere. Every stumble was seen as an act, every limp, a lie. It wasn't occasional, it was constant, every day for years. I got punished for limping, for being tired, for walking wrong. 7, maybe 8 years of this, until finally, a teacher noticed. She pushed them to take me to a doctor. Turns out, I had a real diagnosed condition. But even then, they didn't apologize. They didn't change. They just got quieter about it in front of other people. At home, nothing really changed. So I learned to survive. I taught myself how to walk normally. I spent hours practicing in secret, staring at myself in mirrors, holding onto furniture, forcing my body into shapes that hurt, just so my dad wouldn't explode the next time we went to the store. I wore long pants to hide my legs. I pretended the braces weren't there. It wasn't just the physical pain. It was the shame, the constant fear of being accused, of being called broken, defective, less. That fear followed me into adulthood. Even after I moved out, after I cut contact for a while, that voice, his voice, lived in my head. Loud, cruel, doubting every ache, every bad day. And then, after 30 years of pushing through, my body finally started to give out. My legs couldn't keep up with the lie anymore. I was told I needed major surgery. Not in a few years. Now. Or I'd risk losing the ability to walk at all. And do you know what my first thought was? It wasn't fear about the surgery. It wasn't even the pain. It was shame. Deep, gut-wrenching shame. Like somehow, by agreeing to this surgery, I was admitting my dad had been right all along. That I was broken. That I needed fixing. I was terrified to tell them. Even as an adult, even with doctors backing me up, I could feel that same childhood dread clawing its way back. That belief they had drilled into me, that I was a liar, a burden, a fake. It's hard to explain how deeply that sticks with you, how it warps everything. But here I am, facing surgery, facing decades of buried pain, and finally trying to untangle what's actually wrong from what I was made to feel was wrong. And honestly, that's the hardest part. That hardest part wasn't just the physical pain I was anticipating from the surgery, though God knows there'd be plenty of that. It was untangling the mess of their accusations from my actual reality. You see, the doctor's eventual diagnosis, the one prompted by that blessedly observant elementary school teacher when I was about 7 or 8, didn't magically flip a switch in my parents' deeply ingrained beliefs. Oh, they couldn't outright say I was still faking it when a medical professional with a degree on the wall used official-sounding terms like congenital disability. But their narrative simply twisted, contorting itself to fit their prejudice. Now, the party line, led by my father's booming, alcohol-fueled pronouncements in our cramped, often chaotic house, became, "Well, you must have faked it for so long as a baby and toddler with all that crying and carrying on that you actually made your body this way." Think about that for a second. They genuinely believed a child's make-believe, a toddler's supposed attention-seeking, could permanently alter bone, muscle, and sinew. It was their absurd, cruel way of clinging to their original judgment, of absolving themselves of any fault for the years of punishment. The logic was utterly insane, but in our household, my father's word was the word. No questions asked, especially not by my mother. She, poor woman, just sort of existed in his orbit. a perpetual enabler nodding along, her eyes holding that familiar, haunted flicker of fear and weary resignation. She'd even pat my head sometimes after he'd finished a tirade and whisper, "He doesn't mean it, honey. He's just stressed." But he did mean it. Every single word. So, the corrective surgery the doctor suggested back then, the one that could have potentially given me a normal childhood? Absolutely, unequivocally out of the question. We were dirt poor, scraping by, and any extra money spent on me was already tallied up in their mental ledger as a monumental sacrifice, a burden I was forcing upon them. "We can't afford to fix what you broke yourself with all your carrying on," my father would grunt, usually over the blare of the TV, the implication as subtle as a sledgehammer. Instead, my childhood became a landscape of ill-fitting, clunky leg braces. Oh, the sheer, unadulterated joy of being a kid, hobbling around in those medieval contraptions when the movie Forrest Gump came out. That was a special, refined circle of hell. Every "Run, Forrest, run," shouted across the schoolyard by jeering classmates, every snicker, was another tiny, invisible blade twisting in my gut. Then there was the endless, soul-crushingly useless physical therapy. I remember those sterile rooms, the smell of antiseptic, the therapists with their kind but ultimately helpless eyes, trying their best. But it was like trying to train a goldfish to climb a tree. You can't PT away something you're born with, something woven into the very fabric of your being. The sessions just ended up being another source of frustration for me, and another expense for my parents to resentfully hold over my head. And through it all, the reminders of my cost were constant, a dripping tap of guilt. "Do you have any idea how much these damn braces cost?" My father would bellow if I accidentally scuffed them. "We're shelling out all this money for your problem. Money we don't have." It wasn't just them. Extended family, those charming aunts and uncles at holiday gatherings, felt it was their place to scrutinize my walk, to offer their 2 cents. Neighbors would whisper behind their hands. Even complete strangers at the grocery store, emboldened by my parents' clear discomfort and shame, felt entitled to comment, to stare, to cluck their tongues with pity or, worse, suspicion. "Still walking like a freak, huh?" One of my delightful cousins once quipped at a family barbecue, right in front of everyone, to a chorus of uncomfortable coughs and my father's approving nod. It was in those moments I learned to build my walls higher, brick by painful brick. I perfected that thick skin everyone preaches about, though mine felt more like scar tissue. I mastered the art of the bitter, self-deprecating joke, laughing at myself before anyone else could, a hollow, brittle sound that never quite reached the frozen core of me. The fake normal walk I'd started practicing in the secrecy of my bedroom as a small child became my most vital survival tool, my shield, my camouflage, in a world that seemed determined to expose and punish my difference. It was utterly exhausting, a constant, draining physical and mental strain, trying to pass, trying to blend, trying to simply not be noticed for the one thing that, ironically, defined everyone's perception of me. This condition, this problem, this thing they relentlessly blamed me for, perversely became the very bedrock of my resilience, a twisted, silent badge of honor for simply surviving their hostile world. It wasn't just a disability, it was a daily, hourly testament to what I could endure, what I had to endure. And I did endure. For years, well into my 20s, that manufactured resilience was my armor. I navigated the world with my carefully constructed normal walk, my thick skin deflecting the barbs and stares that still occasionally came my way. People even commented on my walk in the receiving line at my own wedding a couple of years before all this new trouble started. Can you believe the audacity? But I'd learned to offer that quick, self-deprecating smile. The one that said, "Oh, this old thing doesn't bother me," even as a familiar pang of humiliation shot through me. I'd moved across the country, limiting my exposure to my family to a couple of strained, week-long visits a year, usually around Christmas. It was a slow, ongoing process, this dance of distance and obligation. Deep down, despite everything, there's this stupid, stubborn thread of unconditional love. Or maybe just a deeply ingrained sense of responsibility, especially towards my mom and siblings, particularly after I'd had to step into a caretaker role during my teens when my dad's alcoholism hit its peak. Cutting them off entirely felt like a different kind of amputation, one I wasn't sure I could survive, or inflict on the few relatively innocent ones. Therapy, which I'd been in off and on for the better part of a decade, especially with my current psychiatrist for the last few years, had helped me unpack a lot of the trauma to see their behavior for what it was, a product of their own limitations, ignorance, and abuse. I'd even reached a point where I didn't really think of my walk as a disability anymore. It was just me, a fundamental, unchangeable part of who I was, like the color of my eyes. It was the source of my grit, my empathy, my strange, dark sense of humor. I'd made a fragile peace with it. But then, around the time I turned 30, that fragile peace began to shatter. The decades of forcing my body to move in ways it wasn't designed for started to catch up with me, and with a vengeance. It began subtly, an ache here, a stiffness there, problems with my feet from the years of unnatural weight distribution. I dismissed it as just part of the package. But over the last year, the symptoms escalated alarmingly. The numbness began in my toes, a strange, unsettling absence of feeling that crept up my calves. Then came the tingling, like an army of ants marching under my skin, followed by sudden, stabbing electric shocks of pain that would shoot up my legs and make me cry out, sometimes rendering me barely able to walk at all. I'd stumble, my legs buckling, not from the old familiar awkwardness, but from this new, terrifying weakness. My regular doctor, watching this progression with growing concern, finally put his foot down, his voice firm. "You need to see an orthopedic surgeon," he'd said, "and you need to do it now. This isn't something you can just push through anymore." The consult with the orthopedic surgeon was an experience. I went in expecting another lecture on pain management, maybe some new exercises. Instead, the man looked utterly shocked. He was renowned, one of the best in his field. He had me walk, then sit, then lie down, his brow furrowed. He kept asking me questions, his voice tinged with this incredulous tone. "And you've been walking like this your whole life?" He took pictures of my legs, my feet, with his phone, muttering to himself. He commented more than once how genuinely surprised he was that I could walk as well as I did, given what he was seeing. "Most cases this severe," he said, finally looking me straight in the eye, his expression a mixture of professional concern and something akin to awe, "are corrected in early childhood via surgery. Honestly, this is one of the most pronounced, uncorrected instances of this particular congenital condition I've ever encountered in my entire career." He then pulled up the imaging of my lower extremities, a chaotic mess of compromised tissue and clear nerve impingement. The years of forcing my body of that fake normal walk had done serious cumulative damage. Surgery, he explained gently but firmly, wasn't just an option anymore. It was a necessity if I wanted to keep walking at all in the next few years. A necessity. That word echoed in my head for days after leaving the surgeon's office. A cold, hard period at the end of a 30-year sentence of just dealing with it. I scheduled the surgery a couple of months out, moving like a robot through the administrative tasks, my mind a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't quite name. Once the date was on the calendar, a new kind of anxiety set in, a two-headed monster of what-ifs and how-could-Is. The first, and arguably most potent head, was the question of my family. How, when, or even if I was going to tell them. For years, I'd perfected the art of complete avoidance when it came to any talk of my condition. I'd let their snide comments, the casual, "Still walking like a freak, huh?" tossed out by an uncle at Thanksgiving, or my father's knowing grunts if I moved too slowly, just slide off that thick skin I'd cultivated. I knew, with a certainty that settled like lead in my stomach, that they still clung to their narrative. I had done this to myself. Even now as an adult, with a husband, a career, a life built miles away from their toxic influence, the thought of their reaction to, "I need major surgery on my legs," made me physically ill. My therapy had taught me to recognize the patterns, to understand the abuse, but understanding doesn't always equate to immunity from the pain. I was terrified that telling them would rip open all those old wounds, that the shame and humiliation they'd heaped on me as a child would come rushing back, fresh and agonizing. Our relationship was already so tepid, so carefully managed with superficial phone calls and heavily censored topics. This felt like dropping a bomb into a very fragile peace, risking a fight that could shatter even our minimal connection. The other head of this anxiety monster was far more insidious, more personal. It was this profound, unsettling feeling that by fixing my legs, I was somehow losing a piece of myself. I know logically it was either the surgery or face the very real prospect of losing the use of my lower legs entirely within a few years. There wasn't really a choice, not if I wanted any quality of life. But my heart, my identity, that was a different story. For 3 decades, I'd told myself, and the world, that there was nothing wrong with me. My walk was just my walk. It was different, yes, but it was mine. It had shaped my resilience, my determination, my entire outlook on life. To now agree to a surgery that would, as the surgeon put it, require me to relearn how to walk, run, jump, everything, felt like a betrayal of that hard-won acceptance. It felt like I was finally conceding to all those voices from my past, my fathers, the bullies, the judgmental strangers, that yes, I was inherently flawed, that I was made wrong all along. The thought of walking on two good legs, of potentially running without pain, was undeniably exciting, a whisper of a freedom I'd never known. But in the next breath, tears would spring to my eyes just thinking about changing this fundamental part of me forever. It was so deeply intertwined with who I was, with how I'd navigated every single day of my life. Fixing it felt like erasing a part of my story, a vital chapter, however painful. How do you make peace with that? How do you willingly dismantle a part of yourself, even a part that causes you pain, when it's all you've ever known? I spent weeks wrestling with it, playing out scenarios in my head, telling my mom, hoping for a sliver of understanding, only to imagine my father's inevitable explosion of blame in the background. The thought of their judgment, their pity mixed with that undercurrent of, I told you so, in their own twisted, you brought this on yourself way, was unbearable. And then, amidst all this turmoil, reading comments from strangers online, people who understood chronic conditions, people who had faced similar medical decisions, something started to click. A quiet realization began to dawn. I didn't owe them this. I didn't owe them an explanation or a front row seat to my medical journey, especially not after they'd spent a lifetime making my physical existence a source of their displeasure. I lived across the country now. I saw them maybe once or twice a year. I could, theoretically, get this surgery, go through the initial brutal recovery, and potentially be mostly back on my feet by the time I next had to see them. Perhaps next Christmas. If they noticed a change then, well, they noticed. And if they pushed, I could do what I'd finally learned to do for my own sanity. Leave the situation before the old tapes started playing in my head, before I let their poison seep back in. It wasn't their concern what I did with my body, not anymore. It was mine, my decision, my healing, my future. And so, about a month before I originally wrote about all this, I walked into that hospital, my future held in the skilled hands of a surgeon. The surgery itself went well, no complications, the doctor assured my incredibly anxious husband. But those first couple of days, post-op, pure, unadulterated agony. I'm talking pain so excruciating it felt like my bones were on fire, like every nerve ending was screaming. My husband, bless his devoted soul, was my rock. He'd taken a week off work and was there 24/7, helping with everything, holding my hand through the waves of pain, his presence a constant reassuring comfort. I managed to wean myself off the heavy-duty narcotic painkillers after about 5 or 6 days, transitioning to something less potent, but the discomfort lingered. The recovery was tedious, a slow crawl. Crutches became my new best friends, and the four walls of our bedroom my entire world for a while. But even through the haze of pain and the frustration of limited mobility, I started seeing glimpses of the results. Subtle shifts in how my legs felt, a new alignment that brought a surge of fragile hope. I found a new level of patience I never knew I possessed, an endurance born from necessity. The thought of finally trying to walk without crutches, without any device, became my guiding star. Leading up to the surgery and immediately after, I hadn't told a soul beyond my husband, not even my closest friends. I was terrified of word getting out, of the inevitable questions, the pity, or worse, someone innocently mentioning it to my family before I was ready, if I ever would be. Keeping it a secret was incredibly difficult, though. It felt like we were sneaking around, my husband and I, carefully curating our conversations, tiptoeing around the truth as if we had something to be deeply ashamed of. That old, familiar shame, it just has a way of clinging to you. Eventually, the burden became too much. I confided in a couple of my closest friends, women who had seen me through thick and thin, and their unwavering support, their simple, "We're here for you, whatever you need," was like a balm to my frayed nerves. My family, however, remained in the dark. I hadn't planned on telling them, not really. The thought of that conversation still filled me with a cold dread, but then my mom would call, Her usual cheerful chatter about weather and local gossip, always ending with, "So, how's everything with you, honey? Anything new?" And I'd have to force this breezy, "Nope, all good here, Mom," while internally cringing at the lie by omission. It felt wrong, dishonest in a way that started to gnaw at me. Then one evening, about 2.5 weeks post-surgery, she called again with the usual questions. And I don't know what snapped in me. Maybe it was the pain medication wearing off. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or maybe, just maybe, a tiny part of me needed her to know. I just blurted it out, plain and simple, no preamble. "Yeah, Mom." So, I actually had surgery about 2.5 weeks ago. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Then, her voice, when it finally came, was small, shocked. She seemed genuinely, deeply hurt that I hadn't told her. Not so much in what she said, but in the wounded tone that cracked through. "Why, why didn't you mention anything, sweetie?" she asked. And I could almost hear the unspoken accusations. I just told her the truth. "It's always been such a tense, awful subject in our family, Mom. I didn't want to bring it all up again." And for the first time, I think something actually got through to her. There was no defensiveness, no immediate dismissal, just a different kind of silence, and then her voice thick with what sounded unmistakably like shame, like genuine regret. We didn't talk long that day, but that brief exchange lingered. Later that night, restless and emotional, I just thought, to hell with it. I opened up my laptop and started writing. I made a post on social media, a sort of coming out, not just about the surgery, but about what it was like growing up different, about the careless, cruel things people say, the profound feelings of shame and isolation that had haunted me for so long, so intensely, that I'd seriously debated whether to tell anyone about this life-altering procedure. I tried to make it a positive post, though, a reminder that individuals with disabilities aren't exhibits to be stared at or outcasts to be pitied. I wrote that I didn't have the time or the room in my heart anymore for anger or resentment. I was just so incredibly hopeful for the future, so eager for the simple gift of normal mobility. The response was overwhelming. Everyone was so incredibly supportive. And then my parents started calling a bunch of times over the next few days. We played phone tag for a bit, my anxiety coiling with each missed call. When I finally talked to my mom a couple of days later, her voice was different, softer, hesitant. She told me she'd seen my post, and then she said she wanted to start looking at flights to come out and visit me, to help out, cook, shop, anything I needed. I was stunned. I mumbled something about it not being necessary, that I was getting used to the crutches. But she gently persisted, saying she hoped I'd reconsider, that it would make her feel a little better to be able to help me, to be there for me. Apparently, the combination of me getting the surgery, intentionally keeping it from them, and then that very public, very vulnerable Facebook post, where I hadn't even called them out directly, just spoken about the general difficulty of it all, had made both my parents feel, as I'd later found out she'd expressed, horrendously guilty about the way I grew up, about how I was treated. My mother, the woman who had stood by silently for decades, now wanted to try and make it up to me somehow. The world tilted a little on its axis that day. And in the days that followed, as their tentative efforts continued, as my mother kept gently offering to fly out, to cook, to clean, to just be there in a way she never had before, I had to honestly admit that the world had tilted. I told her, truthfully, that I was still deep in recovery and genuinely too busy and overwhelmed in those immediate couple of weeks to host anyone, even her. But I also told her we could revisit the discussion in a little while. A small opening, not a slammed door. It was a strange feeling, appreciating the sentiment, this monumental effort they were suddenly, belatedly putting in. I'd made a kind of peace a long, long time ago, with the hard truth that I would likely never be completely comfortable or truly close with my family. Not in the way you see in movies or read about in books. 30 years of ingrained pain and dysfunction don't just vanish overnight because of a guilty conscience, but seeing this shift, this attempt, it was something. It was proof that maybe, just maybe, people can change. Or at least try to, even when you've long given up hope. I don't want to say I'm glad they feel bad, that this wave of guilt had to be the catalyst. But then again, a part of me, the part that still remembers being that small, confused, hurting child, is kind of glad they feel bad. It shows they're human. It shows that somewhere, buried deep beneath all those years of denial and cruelty, there might still be a flicker of something redeemable. Maybe there's some hope there, not for a perfect family, but for something less broken. And for now, as I focus on my own healing, on learning to trust these new legs, on stepping into a future I define, that tiny, unexpected flicker is surprisingly enough.